Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is City of Heroes on the Rebirth server. We're doing another Let's Rant. We are with Psyop, our level 11 mutation stalker. Can't believe she is one level away from getting DOs. This character's leveling up has gone very quickly. I'm in the process of doing the missions for the university that allow you to learn how to make inventions and stuff. And so we'll just do that. And as we go, it's time for another Scrapperlock rant. So today, actually, I want to talk about something that came up in a Matt Colville video very recently. It started out, he was talking about the Middle Earth role playing game, but he actually ended up telling a story about how he was basically a wang rod, how he was a problem player in one of his games when he was, in I don't know, college or late high school, something like that. And in it, he brings up a few points that I thought would be worth discussing. And his main point, really, in the video, even though he doesn't make that the primary topic, his main point is that when you're in a game group, you and your fellow players and DM need to make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page about just exactly what kind of a game group are you. Are you guys heavy into roleplay? Do you do a lot of what Luke Hart from the DM Lair calls the talkie talkie? Are you really into solving mysteries? When you roleplay, do you guys like doing voices? Do you just talk in third person? Do you just say my character attacks? Or do you like making florid descriptions? Um, how do you approach the role play? For example, in his story, he talked about how when he showed up to the table at this in the Middle Earth role playing game with this group of friends that he'd been playing with for years, he decided to immediately upon the sitting down and starting to play the game with his character, he decided to be 100% in role play, talking in role play, talking as his character, not talking as himself, right, as Matt Colville. And so he said he like hid his character sheet so they couldn't see what class his character was. And this really annoyed one of his friends. Was it just tell me what class you are? Nope. He wouldn't do that. He's a class. What do you mean class? Do you mean am I a noble? No, I'm not a noble, i.e., social class. And he said his friend was like, "Why are you doing this?" And Matt was like, "Doing what? I don't even know you. Why are you asking me?" Right? And so he was essentially staying in character all the time, right, and refusing to make any acknowledge the out of character facts that these guys are friends. They've been playing together for years. And so what Matt was explaining was a situation that's very common in role playing groups when people haven't played before or played together before. It happens a lot with newer players, although it seems like his group had been together for years at this point, so they should have known better, although they were young. But as a game group, when you're first starting out, you don't automatically know each other's likes and dislikes and rhythms. And if you don't realize that this can be a problem when there's a mismatch, if you don't realize that um, having completely different styles to the play can be disruptive and potentially lead to a lot of to being at loggerheads, to a lot of aggravation in a session, you can really end up messing up the group. And if you don't realize that you need to sort of talk this out and figure out what your style is together, then what happens is you don't do that, right? You just I'm going to be always in character all the time, and why is that a problem? Well, because the other players don't want to do that. So when Matt Colville is hiding his character sheet and refusing to tell his friend what class he is, right? His friend was just getting aggravated because he didn't want to play that way, and they didn't used to play that way, and why are you playing that way now, right? And Matt was like, actually, it sounds like he, as a kid, and he admitted this is a bad idea, you know, as an adult, right? He apparently was actually having fun about the fact that his friend was getting aggravated over his being in character. And so um, this can make for a lot of trouble in a game group, right? And so Matt's point here is that you have to kind of, as a group, agree on a style, agree on a tone for the group. Um, One of the more common ways this can screw things up is if somebody in the group decides that this is going to be a comedy campaign and be an utter goofball when everybody else wants it to be serious and to take everything seriously and to make it be, they want it to be Lord of the Rings and one guy in the group wants it to be Monty Python, right? And there's nothing particularly right or wrong with either of those two entities, but they don't necessarily mix very well. And if one part of the group wants it to be one way and the other part of the group wants it to be the other way, you've got a pretty serious mismatch in tone. And that could lead to a lot of aggravation, a lot of frustration at the table because people want the tone to be consistent and they want it to be the tone that they're interested in, right? And so I'm not interested in sort of goofball comedy campaigns. I've tried it once in Champions. We all got together and said, let's do a comedy campaign. The Justice League International comic book was out, and it was really funny. It was sort of a satire on comics, and it was absolutely hilarious. We all were reading it. Everybody in my group. It's one of the only times when literally everybody in my group who collected comics, which was all but one of the guys, every single person was collecting that comic. We would go to the comic book store, and everybody would get a copy of that, and then whatever other stuff. I was reading Captain America. Nobody else read that. Two of my friends were reading X-Men, but the rest of us weren't reading that. But everyone was reading Justice League International, and we thought it was hilarious. And we would call each other up after reading the issues and like just laughing hysterically at how awesome the sort of they were constantly lampooning the classic comic book tropes that we loved in comic books, but they're sometimes really silly and corny and funny, and when you take them seriously and other people are looking like, how can you take this seriously? Well, Justice League International was lampooning that and making that be legitimately funny, and it was absolutely hilarious. It was one of my, like, much to my surprise, because I normally liked serious comic books. Justice League International was one of my favorite comic series for like 2 years as I read through, like, I don't know, it was issues like, I don't know, 18 or something to 38 or 40. I mean, up to like number 50, I think. The General Glory storyline was hilarious. This was like a spoof on Captain America. And they put it out during the, like, whatever it was, 50th anniversary or whatever of Captain America. And so I just thought this was, we thought it was hilarious. We really enjoyed it. And so we said, let's make up a Champions group that's basically Justice League. Let's do that. Let's make it funny. And we tried. We all agreed to do this. We all loved the series. And we created a group called Save Superheroes Against Villains Everywhere, right? Corny, um, a deliberately corny acronym. One of the reasons we chose that was because the one guy in the group had created a really brutal, awful, like, deadly supervillain organization, but he was bad at coming up with names. And it was called SVALO, Supervillains Against Law and Order. And so it was sort of a weird name. But they were serious villains, and they were actually quite powerful. I mean, they were some of the most powerful villains we ever fought. And because this is the best game master that ever ran a Champions game in my group, in my opinion. It was my favorite, and he was a good friend of mine. And He basically taught me how to go from being like just an average GM to being a good GM, in my opinion. Um, I'm not saying that I'm a good one. That's not what I mean by that. I mean, I feel like what I was doing before was significantly less good than what I did after I saw how he was GMing and started copying what he was doing. And so he meant Supervillains Against Law and Order to be a good name in all seriousness, and we all sort of, we tried not to chuckle about it, but it was kind of a silly name. And so when the time came to pick a silly superhero group name, we came. I can't remember who it was that came up with Superheroes Against Villains Everywhere. Not only is it goofy, but it was a spoof on a serious villain name in our campaign, right? So we all agreed to do this. We all said, let's make this comedy campaign save that's basically going to be like JLI, right? And we thought we were going to love it. And we all agreed to it. And we played this thing for, I want to say, one summer. And, the first scenario was funny. The second one, yeah. And then we all kind of, like, one by one, I think, realized, we don't like this very much. We like it better when, like, we're not fighting a villain because he's trying to, like, corner the market on action figures. You know what I mean? But we're fighting a villain because he's threatening to destroy the world. And so, after a while, it just fizzled away. It just faded out. And we just decided to go back to the serious gameplay. Now, that was a case in which everybody was on board with the idea, and it still didn't work because I think it didn't work because even though we were consciously and deliberately and purposely on board with this idea, deep down, it just wasn't natively the style of gameplay that any of us really liked. We thought we were going to like it, but we didn't. Now imagine that none of us but one were fans of Justice League International, and we all want to play a serious campaign. And one player comes in and insists that he's going to play, the cornball, like, Blue Beetle, Justice League International persona that, like, Blue Beetle and Booster Gold were, like, the real comedy characters of that. They were, like, a comedy duo on the group. They generated most of the comedy. And so you're trying to be serious and talk about how this villain is about to destroy the world, and this one guy is just hamming it up. That could lead to a lot of frustration, right? If it frustrated us, even though we had agreed to do it, because it just wasn't natural for any of us to do. Imagine how frustrating it would be if we didn't agree to do it and somebody's trying to kind of force it on the group, right? And so Colville's point, and I think this is an extremely important one, which is why I chose to make a Let's Rant about it, is that as a group, you need to figure out what's your style, what's your tone, what do you guys want to do together out of the game, and try to make sure that you're all on the same page. And it's really important to recognize, folks, that sometimes people just want different things out of the tone and style of a game. And if that's true and you can't compromise about it, it's possible that this might not be a group that can stick together. If you have two people that are trying to play Justice League International and two people that are trying to do an angsty mutant X-Men thing, you're going to be stepping on each other's toes. Now, it's not that it can't work to mix tone, and sometimes you'll see the really good game groups do it, but it's extremely difficult and challenging to mix tone like that and not have it blow up in your face. And it's not something that you can do easily. So the better choice is to have everybody discuss, hopefully, I don't even want to say session 0, maybe even before session 0, talk about what do you want out of this game? What kind of a tone do we all want? And if possible, see if you can all get on the same page and then you can enjoy the game together because you all want the same style and tone out of the game. And if you don't want the same, it's important to know that up front so that you either know to look for a different game group or you guys know to try to manage it and see if you can come up to some kind of a compromise that can help everybody enjoy it. Like you decide, okay, every third scenario is going to be a goofy Justice League comedy scenario and the rest of the time will be serious. And the guys who want the comedy will they'll be serious during the two serious games, and then the guys who prefer the seriousness will, go along with the comedy during the goofball parts. And it's possible if you do that, you might be able to mix tone, but you've got to talk about it and make sure that you can work together. And what you shouldn't do is what Matt Colville describes himself having done in this Middle Earth role playing game session that they were playing, where he just decided arbitrarily a tone that he was going to do hardcore, full on, never out of character role play. And then, as one of the commenters on that video apparently said, because Matt said, "Oh, that's a great point," and read it out loud, he was essentially, he wasn't so much ruining the fun of the other players outright, but he was holding their fun hostage to his preferred style of play, to his preferred tone, and basically saying, you have to come into my area of tone in order to have fun, and I'm going to, basically ruin it for you unless you play with my sense of style and tone. And he readily acknowledges now that that was probably a bad thing to do, and there's no probably about it. It was a bad thing to do. But when you're young and foolish, we sometimes do these sorts of things. And so it's really important to make sure that everybody is on the same page and wants the same thing out of the game. So I said preferably before session zero. I think it depends on how you run your session zero. If you're going to be trying to do stuff, and many gamers do, like rolling up your characters at the table, well, that's a little late to start discussing tone, because if you're rolling up your characters at the table, that means that like you have to know something about the campaign before you roll up your characters. So presumably the GM is going to come to the table with a campaign already prepared for you. And we're doing Curse of Strahd, which is a horror game, not a comedy game. At that point, it's too late to say, what do you want out of this campaign? Deciding it's going to be Curse of Strahd is pretty much already made that sort of cemented in. And so I think you either need to have more than one session zero, or you need to do this ahead of time in some way. Talk about what is the tone, the style of play as a group. Never mind the game or the characters or whether we're going to go level 1 to 20. All those details are trivial, and you can agree on them much more easily than whether you want to play in a brutal horror game or a lighthearted swashbuckling game or a klutzy comedy game, right? That needs to be decided, I think, quite early, and the whole group needs to be on board with it, or else you're going to have a lot of aggravation and frustration, and probably the group is going to break up because you're not enjoying the same things as each other, and you didn't talk about that part earlier. I'm also, as I'm talking about this, reminded of a book I'm reading right now. It's called, hang on, let me look up the name. It is called The Solo Game Master's Guide by Geek Gamers. So Geek Gamers is a pretty popular YouTuber, as these things go, who does a lot of videos and teaching people how to solo different role-playing games and how to solo role-playing games in general. And it's interesting reading the book, she explains how she got started doing this. She said she was an only child. And so there were many times when she was just the only kid in the house and she had to learn to play games by herself because, you know, the adults weren't interested or they were busy. You know, mom is cooking and dad is at work and she's home for the summer and, you know, her friends, I guess, maybe live too far away to come over every day or what have you. So she had to learn how to play games solo. I did this too, by the way. I'm not an only child, I have a sister. But she and I didn't always agree. We didn't always see eye to eye on what games we were going to play. I think once ever in our lives together over many years did I get her to play a game of Stratego. My dad didn't really like what he called a thinking game. He didn't want to have to think too hard. He would do it occasionally with me, but most of the time he wanted something no harder than checkers, and Stratego is a lot more complicated than checkers. So I think I got him to play it with me once. I think I got my sister to play it with me once. I got my friends to play it with me once or twice, but I probably played Stratego 100 times as a kid, and like 95 of those times were by myself because I couldn't get anybody to play it with me, right? So this does happen. Of course, I'm sure it happens more if you're an only child. And so she's developed techniques for how can I still enjoy these games. I think not just role playing games, but also board games like Stratego. How can I enjoy these games by myself when they're not designed to be played by yourself? And so it's an excellent book. I think it's a really good reference for anybody who's interested in trying to do this. And I can highly recommend it. I think it was like $15 on Drive Through RPG. There is a hardcover available from Modifius, I think, but I just got the PDF. And it's quite good. It's well written. It's well organized. And one of the things she says there is this is even soloing. That the first thing you need to do is figure out the style of play, the tone you want, the setting you want to do. And interestingly enough, and this is not something I would have normally done, but I think this is not only something not only that you can, but perhaps should do, not just as a soloer, but maybe even more so in a group, is decide on the tone, the style, and the setting first, and then pick a game that caters to that tone. So, for example, if you sit together and you talk about, oops, I hit the wrong button. If you talk about what you would like to get out of a game, and you guys decide you want to be standard mortal human, vulnerable people who are like more rather victims than heroes, and you're facing horrors of cosmic, inconceivable power. That's Lovecraft, right? It's probably the case that you'd be better off playing Call of Cthulhu or Savage Worlds with the horror companion rules, or a game that is designed to keep your power level down and keep you mortal and vulnerable to insanity and that sort of thing, rather than Dungeons and Dragons, which, yeah, technically has sanity rules, but the power level of the characters does not fit with a cosmic horror where the goal of the play is to be, I said this in an earlier video, puny in comparison to the forces arrayed against you. There is no sense in which player characters in D&D can be considered puny. Higher level characters can take out ancient dragons, and they don't have to be that high. I mean, like 12th level characters can take out a challenge rating 24 ancient red dragon. And they're just way too powerful. Yes, you could always make Yog-Sothoth even more powerful, make him challenge rating 300, but then it just becomes just bizarre, right? Instead of it being a low-key, disturbing, fear for your own mortality type of cosmic horror, you have this weird superhero version of horror where your character is a god, but the horror is like a super god, and that's the fight you're having, right? It's dark side against Yog-Sothoth instead of a human being against a zombie, and just the zombie is going to win because a mortal is at a huge disadvantage against a zombie. Whereas like in D&D, zombies are nothing. You just mow them down, right? And so if as a group you want to have a tone, a style of play that is vulnerable and mortal and weak compared to your enemies and not capable of doing that much, then fifth edition D&D is probably not your game, and you might want to look into games that are designed in the rule system to help you achieve the style, the tone that you want. Now, I'll admit, even for me, when Geek Gamers mentioned this in the book, I was like, I want to play Savage World solo, right? That was really what I was thinking of doing, and um, because I like Savage Worlds and I don't have anybody to play it with, so I wanted to play it by myself and at least get to see how it plays and maybe develop some concepts or ideas that I could someday use if I ever do get to GM Savage Worlds. But her point was, no, make the setting up first. Figure out what the conditions are for the player character or player characters, and then decide, okay, given these conditions, given the setting, given the tone that I want, what's the right game rule set to go along with it. Now, I mean, games like Savage Worlds are generic and flexible. They're designed to be able to play in any setting, and then they have setting books like Fantasy Companion and Horror Companion and Science Fiction and Superpowers Companion. So presumably you could say we're going to use Savage Worlds and then pick the companion that fits the setting best, Deadlands, whatever. And that's true. You could do that. Um, but at least you need to have the conversation, and her suggestion, and I think it's a good one, is that you should do that first, right? Decide, what are we really about here? Are we about horror role playing? Are we about high adventure? Are we about superheroing? Are we about comedy? Are we about satire? What is it thematically, in the big picture sense, that we want to do here as a table? And knowing what that is, what game system that we all know about, and each one of you will know different game systems, what game system would be the best to help us realize that setting? And that instead of wrestling with the game system to get it to do what you want when it really doesn't, you can pick a game system that's a natural fit. So Matt Colville in another video had this really great point. He said a lot of people don't understand old school D&D, and he said when you really think about it, old school D&D from like first edition, AD&D, etc., was really a survival horror game. You went into the dungeon and everything was way more powerful. Even a goblin could kill you with one or two hits, and you were trying to survive against the odds using nothing but your wits, some equipment, and one or two spells, which is all you had at your disposal early on. And so if you want to hear more about that, watch Colville's video about what's the point of a dungeon. And he just put it out recently, and it's a very good discussion. It's brilliant. It's one of his better videos. But and he wasn't really connecting that to his video about the Middle Earth role-playing game and tone, but I'm connecting it because it's actually very tightly related, since he talked about how it's very hard to do that sort of game in 5th edition because the way the rules are built, they don't assume a survival horror role-playing game. They assume a more narrative, cinematic type of role-playing game. And there's nothing wrong with a cinematic game. Savage Worlds is meant to be cinematic. But the assumptions of a cinematic, pulpy kind of a game are different from the assumptions of a survival horror game. And so for some reason, he said he wouldn't recommend people go back and play old school D&D. I mean, I could see AD&D not recommending that because it's super complicated, but I don't see any reason why you can't go back and play the basic and expert set. They're fine. And those games would give you a survival horror game if that's what you're looking for, right? Now, if you're looking for the swashbuckling high adventure game, then first edition basic expert D&D is not your game, right? You probably do want something more like 4th or 5th edition, maybe 3rd, maybe Pathfinder. So the idea is, okay, what kind of a game do we want? What kind of sessions do we want to have each week or each month or whatever? And then what game supports those kinds of sessions? And um, rather than trying to force every type of game to be 5th edition D&D, recognize that there are lots of games out there that have different tones and styles baked into their rules. And it's a lot easier, and you might find it a lot more fun if you use a game whose rules are there in support of the style and tone that you want. And this is exactly the point that Geek Gamers makes in the solo GMing book, that if you pick the game ahead of time, if you say, I'm going to play 5th edition D&D, and then when you start using oracles to randomly come up with a story or use your own brain to come up with a setting, right? You do 5th edition, and then you say, I want to play in the Ironsworn setting. Well, you can. But I think 5th edition would be a very difficult fit for Ironsworn because D&D 5th edition is not this sort of very low magic. Matt Colville describes a campaign that his friend Phil ran, Valengard, I think it's called, and they were just sort of spitballing about how they would maybe, if they wanted to, make some sort of a supplement for it if people wanted to play in it. And Matt said you're going to have to house rule or homebrew a whole lot of like your own subclasses and stuff because there's virtually no magic in Valengard except a little bit of magic that's accessible to the player characters. So you could see what Rollmaster would call semi-spell users being allowed, but not pure casters because it's a low magic world. And most of the monsters don't use magic either, right? Because it's a low magic world, and you're not going to find a lot of magic items because it's a low magic world. And the thing is that the design of 5th edition D&D makes a series of assumptions about the world that aren't true of this world of Valengard. And so Matt's point was we're going to have to house rule or homebrew an awful lot of stuff. You're going to have to redo the monster stat blocks. You're going to have to redo a bunch of the classes. You're going to have to redo spells. At that point, it's almost like you're writing your own game. It's not really 5th edition D&D anymore because you've had to change so many rules. And by the way, this even happens a little bit in some of the official D&D modules. For example, I've never played it, but from what I understand, Curse of Strahd, there are a whole bunch of like planar teleporting and those sorts of spells that are just they hand wave it and say those spells just don't work in Barovia, which is where Curse of Strahd takes place. They just don't work here, right? And why do they do that? Why do they make that hand wave? Because the designers realize that their own game doesn't, if you leave it exactly the way the rules are, it doesn't support the type of horror role playing in an extra planar dimension that they're trying to go for here. The 5th edition rules are actually a poor fit for Curse of Strahd, which is why they had to like house rule a bunch of stuff in the module to like disallow a whole bunch of things that normally 5th edition allows, right? And so what that tells me is the Curse of Strahd is actually not a great fit for the 5th edition game system, and it might be that Pulp Cthulhu or Savage Worlds with the Horror Companion or something would have been a better fit for the adventure that is Curse of Strahd. Now, obviously, Wizards of the Coast made Curse of Strahd. They are the publishers of Dungeons and Dragons. They made it as a Dungeons and Dragons supplement, so they're not going to suggest that you use a different game system. But I think Geek Gamer's point is really well taken, that you can do yourself a disservice by choosing a game system first and then saying, okay, what kind of a game do we want to play? And so her recommendation, and I think it's a really good one, And I think this is what Matt is sort of saying too. Decide, do you want to play survival horror or pulpy adventure or narrative driven or highly social game or a comedy game? What do you want to do? Decide that up front as a conversation, as a group. And then once you know that, then say, okay, what rule system is best at supporting this style of play that we want? And then go for that rule system. Now, I realize this for many people, this is a hard sell because they came into the hobby, if they're newer especially, they came into the hobby literally to play 5th edition D&D. Maybe they came into the hobby to play Critical Role or to play Acquisitions Incorporated or to play Stranger Things. These are um, pop culture uh, shows or whatever that get people interested in, have gotten people interested in D&D and made them want to play. So it's going to be really hard to say to them, well, look, I know Stranger Things plays D&D and Critical Role plays D&D, and D, and that's what you want to play, but actually the type of game you're suggesting here, which is highly cartoonish and comical, we'd be better off playing the game Toon, right? A lot of people are going to balk at that and say, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here to play D&D. But it might just be that a different game system would be better. And it's you're doing yourselves a disservice by not at least exploring the possibility that you might be better off with a different game. So even before session 0, because usually in session 0 it's too late to pick the game, that's already been decided. Before session 0, in email, around the water cooler, in Discord, on a forum, however it is that you guys are communicating with each other outside of session time, talk with each other about tone and style and what you want out of the game, and make sure that you all want the same thing. That's step 1. And then, assuming that you do, ask yourselves objectively, fairly, right, without biasing yourselves in favor of Champions or Savage Worlds or something, or D&D, ask yourselves what game best supports the style of play we've all agreed that we want. And then, wow, level 12 already. I really didn't think we were going to hit that tonight. And then, having picked the style of game and the game that supports it, you should be in good shape. Then you can go ahead and have a session 0 and make up characters at the table if you want, and everything should work because you've thought about it and talked about it ahead of time, and because you've all come to an agreement as to the nature and tone of the game. So that's my advice to you guys. I think that that I definitely will have this conversation if I ever GM again with my players. Like, step 1 is going to be, I'm not running fantasy high magic or even medium magic ever again. It's either low magic or I'm not going to run it. That's the tone I want. I think that the more magic you, ironically but unsurprisingly, the more magic you have in a world, the less powerful the magic seems. When everybody's throwing magic around all the time, it's no longer unique and special and interesting, and therefore it just doesn't seem powerful. And I want the magic to seem and to be powerful. And to me, the only way I can think of to do that is to make it rare. I also hate the idea of the generic +1, +2 magic items. I know they're a thing in a lot of fantasy games. I think it's just silly. So I would only have like actual artifact or relic type magic items, named magic items where it's like unique. It's the only one like it in the world, like Andoril or Narsil in Lord of the Rings. I'm not going to have +1 daggers and +1 short swords and +1 short bows. I find that to be not interesting. I prefer a more realistic, like a medieval authentic type of a game. If we're going to do fantasy, that's what I prefer. Now, I can play the sort of D&D fantasy, sort of pseudo fantasy, just fine as a player. I don't mind doing that. But as a game master, when I have to keep my head in the world for many hours in between sessions, the world's got to be something I like. and high magic or even medium magic, I'm not a fan of that. So, so yeah, I think in if I'm ever called upon to GM again, I would say, well, if you guys need to understand that if you want me to run a fantasy game, it's not going to be high magic, and therefore D&D will not be appropriate for the game because D&D is it's a high magic game. And so yeah, I would say, well, we could play Harnmaster, or maybe we could play Savage Worlds with appropriate restrictions on how many powers you can take per advance so that it stays a low magic game. And you're going to have to accept that there aren't going to be a lot of magic items, and there aren't going to be a lot of spells, and your character is going to be, um, you know, more non-magical than magical, even if you're a caster. And you're just going to have to accept that. And if you don't like that, then don't ask me to run a fantasy game. Um, if I ran a champions game, it's not going to be a comedy game. It's not going to be goofball. It's going to be serious. So you got to be on board with that tone. And so this is where you talk about it ahead of time, right? I do want to point out, guys, that saying, look, this is the type of game I want to run and I'm not willing to run a different game is not the same thing as what Matt Colville was doing, where I said he was holding fun hostage, because the conversation about the tone we're going to have and how we're going to run the game happens before you play the game. Okay? And that's what Colville didn't do, right? He didn't talk to his friends and get them all to agree to this style of play that he was doing. It is perfectly okay, in my opinion, at the top of the discussions at the beginning to say, there are certain things that I don't like, and not going to play the game if they're in the game. Or there are certain things I do like, and I need them in the game. Um, in model railroading, I don't know if I've mentioned this before. I feel like I have. But in model railroading, which I did for a long time, I have a model train layout in my house. They have a system when you're first setting up your layout. Um, Nobody can ever make their layout be 100% the way they want. You never have the room or the money. The models don't exist that you need, etc., etc. And so what I know is John Armstrong or Lynn Westcott, I think it was one of them, I can't remember now, came up with a method of deciding what has to be in your layout and what would you like to be in your layout but you could maybe live without. And it's called Givens and Druthers, right? Givens are non-negotiable. Given this layout will be a 4x8 on a 4x8 sheet of plywood or on a hollow core door. Um, Given this layout will be no bigger than X because that's how much space I have. Given putting this layout in my basement and I've got to leave room for the maintenance guy to get to the hot water heater, right? Given this will be a layout set in the 1950s. Then your druthers are what you would like to have if you had your druthers, if you had your way. But you're willing to live without them as long as you have your givens. So your druthers might be that you want a really cool double-decker layout, but you can live with a single decker, right? Double deckers where you've got one layer above the other, right? And the trains move between the layers, usually on some hidden helix of track in the back, like in another room. They go through a hole in the wall, go all the way up the helix, and then come out the other side, and it looks like you have two different trains on the track when it's really just one. It's very cool, but it's very hard to do, and so maybe perhaps you say that's my druthers, but not a given, right? I'm not going to say I have to have it, but I'd like to have it. And so, so what I actually intend to do with my players is ask them for their Givens and Druthers. I'm going to say, don't give me 25 Givens, right? Pick one or two, at most three, things you have to have, right? What are your Givens? And I can almost guarantee my best friend's given, one of them is going to be high magic, right? And if my given is low magic, that tells us that we have a conversation we need to have. Now, maybe what we're calling givens are actually druthers, and we can live without them, and then that's fine. So, for instance, as a player, I would list low magic as druthers rather than given. It's something that it would be nice to have, but I don't have to have it. As a game master, though, where I have to live in the world in between sessions, unlike a player where you're only living in the world for a few hours every 2 weeks, as a game master, I would say low magic is a given, not druthers, right? And so what I plan to do, among other things, before session 0, I'm going to send them out like a questionnaire. I've already got it written. And among other questions, it's going to be, what are your givens and druthers, right? I'm also going to ask them to give me their lines, their veils, and another Colville invention is the NMC, which means not my character. So it might be, let's say, slavery. You don't really care if we roleplay that slavery exists, but you don't want to roleplay that your character is a slave, right? And so I'm going to ask them for their lines, which means you don't cross this line, we don't roleplay about it at all. Veils, which means it's fade to black. We can say that it exists in this world, but we're not going to roleplay directly about it. And then NMC, not my character, is it may not be a line or a veil. It's just I don't want to personally roleplay about it. And so, so I think doing an exercise like that before you ever have a session 0, before you pick the game system, and I would say to players, please don't put 5th edition D&D in your givens, right? Let's see what tone and style and set of other givens people have. And then after we collate this, let's see, is there a game that will fit all of this? It might be that Star Frontiers or Lion and Dragon or Pulp Cthulhu or Harnmaster or Rollmaster or the Middle Earth role-playing game or the One Ring or Forbidden Lands or the game Alien or Deadlands, the Weird West, or Holler might be the thing that perfectly fit your Givens and Druthers. But you can't do that if somebody puts Deadlands in their Givens. And now you're preempting everybody from picking a different game system. So try to put as little as you can in Givens, put more in Druthers, and then get together as a group and see, can we come to an agreement on all the things we feel we must have to enjoy our game system and enjoy our sessions. And if you can do that and come to an agreement on that stuff, then you can decide, okay, what game system most perfectly aligns with these Givens and Druthers. And then you can have your session 0 and everybody's on board and everybody is on the same page. And guys, I think you'll have an amazing, amazing campaign. Because you decided from the beginning the tone and style you want, the game system that fits that tone and style. That means every session, it feeds on itself, right? It reinforces itself. Not only are you guys all explicitly trying to maintain a certain tone, but the system is helping you maintain that tone. So if you want this survival horror, and you say, well, let's pick, if not basic and expert set, maybe old school essentials or one of the other basic fantasy or one of the other old school games. And so you're playing using basic fantasy role play and you're keeping track of every arrow and you're keeping track of the rations and the water and the light source, because those are the things you need to do in a survival horror. If the light goes out, you die, right? You're in trouble because the bad things can see in the dark and you can't, and that's really important in D&D, and so in original D&D. And so you've agreed on survival horror, you've picked a system that by default is a survival horror. So all the DM has to do is make up a big dungeon and send you guys into it, and you just play your class, and you will have a survival horror game, which is the tone you said you wanted. Similarly, if you want a superhero game with characters flying all over the battlefield and blasting each other through walls, and you want it to be lots of exaggerated behavior. I forgot we had a level up here, so we'll do that as I talk. Exaggerated behaviors like soliloquies, talking in the middle of combat, making speeches, presence attacks, this kind of thing. Well, that sounds like Champions, right? And if that's the tone you want, that's the tone Champions is going for, right? Sort of silver, bronze age superhero stuff. Well, it's perfect. That's a perfect fit. It's a match made in heaven. And the game system will reinforce the exact type of theme and tone you were going for. And so it feeds on itself, right? Instead of saying we're going to play Champions, but we're going to do like low magic fantasy. I mean, yes, you technically can with the hero system, although it'd be hard to do with the Champions version of the hero system. But Champions itself is not necessarily a good fit for that. It will be fighting you on the tone instead of reinforcing it. And then you're going to just get frustrated. So my advice is do all this sort of work ahead of time, whether it's Givens and Druthers or something else, to help each other figure out what tone you want. Gosh, what do I want? Mind over body or... Oh, this boosts the attacks. Yeah, let's do that. So where was I? Pick, whether it's Givens and Druthers or something else, figure out a way to talk before session 0 as a group. Maybe just Zoom or something, a pre-session 0. It doesn't have to be 4 hours. It could be half an hour. Do a little bit of writing ahead of time with each other, give each other lists of things to think about, and then come together and say, what do we want to achieve here? What is our dream scenario of how our game will play at the table? Is it going to be creepy and slow? Is it going to be fast action? Is it going to be a lot of combat? Is it going to be more investigating? Is it going to be very skill heavy? I mean, do we want to do a lot of like research and using a lot of different types of skills like hacking? What is it? Do we want something very modern? Do we want it to feel ancient? Are we uncovering secrets, or is everything out in the open? Figure all that out first and then say, okay, what game system supports this? Maybe you have to do a little research, right? You might not be able to do this in a pre-session 0 at the table. And then when you come to an agreement on those things, your session 0 will just go very quickly and very easily, and hopefully you'll have a fantastic time every session because you have a system that feeds into the tone and a tone that feeds into the system, and you've agreed on both of them. And if you can do that together, you'll probably have an awful lot of fun. So hopefully that was, I don't know if that's a rant, it's more kind of like advice. Hopefully that helps, and let me know what you think in the comments and whether you have other tricks besides Givens and Druthers and lines and veils to figure out how to keep everybody on the same page and make sure that you all want the same thing out of a role-playing game. Until next time, folks, I am Scrapperlock, and this has been Let's Rant on the Rebirth server.